President Trump signed a new executive order this week expanding access to the controversial and morally questionable IVF procedure. And Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is launching an investigation into the safety of the abortion pill, mifepristone. Here to unpack it all, neuroscientist and senior ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, Father Tad Pacholczyk. Father, welcome back to the show. I want to start with these executive orders expanding access to IVF that the president has signed. Now, he's long been an advocate of this procedure, at least since the last campaign. And I asked him about this last October, just weeks before his election. Watch.
The other day you said, I'm the father of IVF. As you know, some Catholics feel, and the Catholic Church believes, when you implement this technology, you're killing embryos. Will you have a religious exemption to your IVF mandate for religious organizations and businesses that feel this violates my religious principles?
Well, you know, I haven't been asked that, but it sounds to me like a pretty good idea, frankly. But even Catholics, a lot of them, they want IVF. It's fertilization, basically. Mm-hmm. And, you know, they view that as helping a family, helping parents have a child. And it's a very popular thing, but certainly if there's a religious problem, I think people should go with that.
Father, I want to get to this religious exemption in a second, but the president, like so many Christians and frankly Catholics, view IVF as simply another means of having children. It's just fertilization, the president said there. Tell us what the moral concerns are with this technology.
Well, you know, I think it's good to start out and emphasize that it's good to hear the president seeing the importance of family formation. And, you know, this is really a classical question of good ends and a question of what are the appropriate means to pursue that. So, you know, there are a number of concerns that arise in the wake of this technology. This has been a technology that has just galloped forward, largely driven by commercial concerns. And I mean, among the concerns that just immediately bubble up, you hinted at it in your question to the president, there is this propensity to produce extra embryos, many of whom will either be discarded or frozen. And sometimes they get caught in stasis for literally decades or forever. They're never rescued out of that freezing situation. There are also other concerns when people do in vitro fertilization. There is known to be a higher risk of birth defects in the babies that are born this way. There's a lot of other, you know, untoward things that occur. For example, sex selection of the embryo. Do you want a boy? Do you want a girl? Trait selection, other types of screening that goes on. So there's this quality control, which is, of course, just a fancy word for eugenics that is part and parcel of this entire technology. And finally, you know, you've certainly heard of the situations when people are implanted with 3 or 4 embryos, and what happens if they all take? Well, then you have to have what's called a selective reduction, and they go in and destroy 1 or 2 of the growing babies in that case to help with the pregnancy for the remaining 2 babies. So, you know, these are all reminders to us of how this is called a pro-life, pro-family technology, but at its core, it's not. It's actually a two-edged sword, and there's a death-dealing edge to the sword that pops up throughout the entire practice of in vitro fertilization.
Father, you raised the moral concerns here about IVF. On the other hand, in the Catholic sphere, and this is where I think a lot of the confusion comes from, we've heard of adopting these embryos that are frozen, where women come in and say, you know, I'm going to adopt this frozen embryo, and she has it implanted in her womb, and now, you know, does that suddenly make it moral? Is it now a moral good?
Well, I think that, first of all, the Church, in its most recent document on the question of embryo adoption, was very clear that there are significant concerns around this. And in some cases, it pointed out that it's not allowed at all. For example, if it's done as a treatment for infertility, it is not allowed at all. So you ask yourself, all right, if the Church is saying there are some circumstances in which embryo adoption is simply forbidden, then, what's behind that? There's a lot of concerns. And so the other piece, though, you got to be practical here, Raymond, I think. You got to understand we have a multi-billion-dollar industry, and they're going to be very interested in something like this because then they'll say, well, then we can produce as many extras as we need. We can even make more of them because now we have a new market. We can start selling these embryos, or they won't call it that. They'll call it facilitating the transfer to couples that might be willing to do something like an embryo adoption. So you actually feed into the cycle of cooperation in evil by promoting something like this.
Father, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled over a year ago that frozen embryos created via IVF are children under Alabama state law. Your thoughts on that ruling, and does that really take care of the moral dilemma created by IVF in the first place?
Well, I think certainly that ruling was the first kind of legal attempt to bring some coherence to this issue. I think we have had a lack of coherence where, on the one hand, if a couple wants an embryo, then the embryo has to be protected. They would be concerned if the clinic was to lose the embryo or destroy the embryo. But then on the other hand, as soon as the clinic wants to discard embryos, then they just become cells and property. So we've been in this situation where we're calling the embryo different things depending on what it is we want. And I think the Alabama decision cut through that and said, no, we can't do that. We've got to be consistent and coherent here.
So, Father Tad, I don't want to run out of time. If you were advising the Trump administration on policy vis-a-vis IVF, what would you tell them?
Well, Raymond, I mean, I think there are a number of things. One is regulation is what's needed here, not cooperation or encouragement of this practice. We need to do something like Italy and Germany have done, where they say whenever you do IVF, you're not allowed to make extra embryos. You can only make a maximum of 3, all of whom must be implanted into the mother. So regulation instead of funding and cooperation. Secondly, I think we should set up some advisory commissions here. I don't know if you remember during the first Trump term, he set up something called the Human Fetal Tissue Ethics Advisory Board. And I actually was a member of that board, and we made decisions about funding for experiments that used fetal tissue. It was amazing, the work that they did. And, we need some more advisory commissions like that. You may recall under George Bush, the President's Council on Bioethics did similar work and advising. There was nothing comparable under Obama or Biden. And then, another thing that needs to be done here, we need to fund and promote real treatments for infertility. So in other words, figure out what are the underlying causes. Why is this couple not able to have a baby? That whole approach gets sidelined as soon as you offer the IVF industry to couples. They go down that road almost immediately.
Well, not to interrupt, but we should be offering NAPRO technology and so many of these other, not only morally agreeable techniques, but proven advances in medicine that have helped families have children.
Absolutely. And to make sure that there is good insurance coverage and reimbursement for all of those, because so often couples are like, well, that sounds good, but that's not going to fit under my plan. So very, very important to do that. And, use other approaches to supporting and encouraging those who desire larger families. I mean, simple things like tax breaks, fair wages for the breadwinner, creative solutions to pay for high educational costs, and, for healthcare. I mean, healthcare, when you're thinking of having a large family, you worry about that kind of thing as well.
I've got to move on to this. An announcement by the new HHS Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He wants to start an investigation into the safety of the abortion pill. Here's the quote. What Trump has asked me to do is study the safety signals, and I think that's worth doing. Father, your thoughts on this and the risks of this abortifacient pill?
This is a common sense type of a request coming from the president. This is something that's routinely done when new pharmaceuticals come into the market. You want to track side effects, deleterious outcomes, and there's been a kind of squelching of that. And I'm glad to see that there is, at a minimum, some call here for coherence around this issue as well. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's a tragedy that so many abortions are going in the direction of the abortion pill. The percentage is rising each year, and it's important that we track at least the side effects and dangerous outcomes that are part and parcel of this.
Father Tad Pacholczyk, we will leave it there, and you can read Father Tad's commentary on the National Catholic Bioethics Center website. They're at ncbcenter.org. Father Tad, thanks.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you, Raymond.